Hello, everyone, and welcome to our recording of our presentation, Critically Rethinking Citation Bibliometrics. In this presentation, we're going to try to give you a critique of kind of the standard way that faculty publications evaluated using citation bibliometrics, and then suggest to you some possible alternatives with particular reference to some ongoing research that Ala and I have been working on using document analysis to understand the publication trends of faculty in Japanese university. There's a QR code on your screen, which is a link to these slides. So if you like, you can scan that QR code and that should take you straight to the slides. And we've recorded this just in case something goes catastrophically wrong during the actual presentation. So hopefully you'll be seeing us live, but if you're watching this video, that means that something's gone wrong. So welcome, and we hope you enjoy the presentation. I'm Theron Muller from Waseda University.
And I'm Salem from Waseda University.
And I'm John Adamson from the University of Niigata Prefecture.
All right, and so we're going to jump right into the presentation, starting with a citation that goes back to the very origins of the concept of counting citations in order to evaluate journal quality. And so what was interesting to me when I kind of tracked this down was Gross and Gross were librarians, and in their paper, they argue that librarians need to make decisions about which journals to subscribe to and which journals not to subscribe to. And they claim that asking the people on the faculty which journals a library should subscribe to is not objective. It's a kind of subjective way of deciding what to subscribe to. And so they were looking for an objective measure to evaluate which journals to subscribe to. And they came across, or they ended up developing this system to count citations. And so that was back in 1927. And then when you fast forward to the 50s and the 70s, Garfield used their paper, cited their paper, when he was trying to understand scholarly output using very early computers. And so basically what he would do is he would put a list of journal references, journal citations on computer cards, and then he would do analyses of how much journals cited one another in order to try to evaluate the overall quality of journals. And because he was working with contemporary computers of the time, computing power was really expensive. And so kind of by necessity, he needed to narrow down the journals that were included in these lists in order to justify the cost of running them through the very expensive to use computers. And so he ended up basically saying he would include one standard deviation's worth of references, which is about 60% of the references. And then everything outside of that was excluded. And Garfield's original system eventually became what is the Web of Science today, which will become important because we're going to be citing the Web of Science later on in the presentation. And then John's going to bring you up to date with some more recent research.
Yeah, I mean, more recently then, Nygaard and Belanova noted that the idea of bibliometric quantification of publications, quote, not only threatens to erode the diversity in scientific practices, but can also systematically disadvantage scholars whose practices differ from the norms established by the indicators, unquote. Now, that's a really important quote there, because it indicates a clear kind of exclusionary effect on scholars researching outside of the Anglophone center, particularly the Global South. So they are disadvantaged by this metrification trend in general. Over to you both.
Well, thank you, Professor John. So as we all thought for years that journal impact factors have been a standard measure of research quality. But studies have shown that they may not be as reliable as we think. And based on Siglin's argument that the impact factors of journals should not be used as a measure to evaluate individual research quality. So one of the main reasons is that impact factors are often influenced by a small number of highly cited papers, which means that they do not accurately reflect the impact of most articles published in a journal. So as you can see in this slide, that Sieglin investigated that there is a weak or a poor correlation between the journal impact factor and the actual citation rate of individual articles. And this weak correlation suggests that a journal's reputation doesn't directly translate to the impact or quality of every article it publishes. So using factors for evaluating can be misleading, as it overlooks the diverse contribution of researchers, especially in fields that produce fewer citations or in non-English language contexts. So Sieglin's findings highlight why evaluating research quality should focus on article level metrics rather than journal level indicators. And I will leave Professor Thurn to elaborate more on this discussion.
Yeah, so just to orient you to the graphs that are in front of you on the screen, Saglin's plotting the impact factor of the journal on the x-axis, and then the number of times a given article has been cited on the y-axis. So each of those dots represents an article published in a particular journal. And if the impact factor of the journal matched the number of citations or correlated with the number of citations, you'd see kind of the dots lining up, going from the bottom left toward the top right. But instead, you kind of get what looks like a random scatter plot. There isn't really a clear correlation between the impact factor of the journal and the number of times that an article is cited, as Allah just explained to you. And while we've shown you kind of the most photogenic of Saglin's arguments, in his article that he makes 21 different arguments for why the impact factor of a journal isn't a good metric to use. And so this is kind of, if you're interested in following up on that, we have the references toward the end of the presentation, but this is kind of one of the many arguments for why it's a poor metric to use to evaluate scholarship. And we're going to turn to one more manuscript next. Allah?
Yes, so I want to give you just a brief overview on this key piece of research by Michael Fire and Carlos Gwistern in their paper Over Optimization of Academic Publishing Metrics. So they make a powerful argument that citation metrics do not accurately measure the quality of research. So they refer to Goodhart's law, which essentially states that once a measure becomes a target, it stops being a reliable measure. So in that case of academic publishing metrics like citation counts or H-index and journal impact factors, they were originally meant to indicate research influence. However, now that these metrics are widely used to assess researchers and institutions, they have been also subjected to manipulation. So this brings us to the next point, which is over-optimization. So the authors highlighted that researchers and institutions may game the system to increase or inflate their citation counts through self-citation or citation cartels, or even prioritizing publications in high-impact journals, even when the research is not particularly innovative. So this leads us to the situation where citation numbers increase, but the true quality of research doesn't. And another key point is that there is a distinction between quantity and quality. So citation metrics reward researchers that get cited frequently, but highly cited work is not always equivalent with high quality or impactful research. And in some cases, papers are only cited because they are controversial or even because they are flawed. So the last point I wanted to elaborate on is that citation metrics have a narrow scope. So they primarily measure academic influence within established fields and leaving out those emerging or interdisciplinary areas, which may be equally important, but it don't yet gain as much attention. So this investigation leads us to question whether these metrics truly reflect the quality of the work being produced or not. Professor, sorry for taking from your time. Please continue.
Okay, so just looking at some of the main findings from the Fire and Gwestrin paper, one thing they found was the increase in publication frequency over time. So here you can see kind of the light blue line with the low slope are people whose careers started closer to the 1950s, and that's looking at how many papers they publish over time. And then the darker blue lines with the steeper slopes are people whose careers started closer to the present day. And basically what you can see is over time, the number of papers people produce after writing their first paper is increasing, and Fire and Gwestrin argue that's in response to the citation metrics being used to evaluate scholars. Kind of intuitively, I think another thing that's happened is as scholars are producing more papers, they're also making more self-citations. And one reason for that is that they're publishing more, period. And then another reason for that, Fire and Gwestrin argue, is this use of citations to evaluate scholars means that they have an incentive to cite themselves more often as they continue to publish. And so next, what we want to do is move into a discussion of some of the consequences for academic knowledge production of these issues that we've raised. And I think it's over to you, John.
Yeah, well, the first, as you see on the slide here, we're saying that chasing citations or indexing pushes authors away from what's interesting to them to research to simply what is trending. Now, when we think about that movement, then there are two articles that I'd like to refer to. The first one is by Kanagaraja and Lee, which is interesting because that looked into an emerging non-center scholar, happened to be Lee from Korea, studying in the Anglophone Center, and how that emerging scholar, that person, he wrote an article, he submitted it for a certain intended category. And when he got feedback, the journal editors said to him, right, that looks good, but we don't want to publish you in this category. We want you to publish this article in another category, which wasn't the author's intention. Now, younger emerging scholars have this pressure. They want to get published. They want to get a certain number of publications to get their first job or promotion, etc. So there was a great deal of pressure. But in this situation, the emerging scholar said, no, I want to publish it in the intended category. Now, this runs the risk. Well, first of all, it's in one side of the coin is that it's good that that author exercised their agency, which is to be encouraged. But the danger is that the editors can just turn around and simply say, we deselect you, we reject you, you're not doing what we're saying. So they exert a power over the author. So there's a kind of journal kind of power over younger authors, especially who are desperate to publish. The next article, which I think is relevant to this movement towards trending, is by Gruber. And Gruber was saying, well, basically the idea of using metrification as a benchmark to assess scholarly work is a neoliberal academic sellout. It's quite a strong expression, but that can be, as we can see in Kanagaraja's and Lee's study, there are pressures on authors to publish in journals and fields only to seek higher citation count, which is really contrary to the academic integrity that we're seeking. Okay, let's go on to the next one. And really continuing that argument there, as we see on the slide here, less prolific fields and journals are pushed even further to the margins and forced to appeal to a center audience. So another consequence of this metrification. Well, first of all, indexing organizations, Scopus, Impact Factor, they're termed as centering institutions by Lillis, and they exert a kind of centripetal force or trend on journals wishing to be indexed, which means that there's an homogenization. They are forcing journals to follow certain Anglocentric norms, primarily in English, writing in a certain way for certain subjects. And that in turn, from the pressure on the journals, passes on to the authors. And the authors then are pushed into following Anglocentric norms as set by the indexing organizations. So the result of this then, quite clearly, is that it forces authors to write their papers to appeal to a center audience, because that's what the indexing organizations want them to do. And Kanagaraja, again, has reported on this. Now, if their papers are not geared towards that center audience and that trending theme, they risk exclusion, rejection, or what Lillis and Curry call outscaling by the center journal editors. And so they, as we can see here, they are moving into areas of research that they originally maybe are not interested in, just to get published. Okay, back to you, Theron and Ala.
Yeah, thank you, Professor John. So to discuss some of the citation disparities, it's important to highlight this critical finding from recent research from Liu and Rahwan paper. So I can summarize this paper in 3 points. And the first point is that non-traditional authors are significantly underrepresented on editorial boards. And this lack of representation can influence, of course, the visibility and citation of their work. The second point, I wanted to add that manuscripts submitted by non-traditional authors tend to spend more time under review. And of course, this delay in publications can negatively impact their citation rates. And lastly, that even after publication, papers that are authored by non-traditional scientists, they receive fewer citations than expected based on some textual similarity. And this indicates a bias in citation practices. So Leo and Rahwan, a comprehensive study, they have analyzed 1 million papers from 6 publishers over the past 2 decades. And their findings revealed significant inequalities in editorial boards representation and review times, and also citation rates for non-white scientists. So these differences highlight systematic barriers that non-traditional authors face, which can, of course, delay their academic careers and their contribution to the research. And I will leave Professor Theron to finish this discussion.
All right. Thank you very much for that overview, Ala. So hopefully the picture that we're drawing for you here is pretty clear. The disparities that exist in wider society are being replicated within academia. And so if you wanted to give a scholar advice for how to be successful based on the kind of metrics that are being used right now, then that advice could include, don't be a minority, be white, don't be based outside of the Anglophone center, be based at universities in the US. And so hopefully that helps to reveal or helps to make clear some of the larger systematic problems with using these citation indexes to evaluate scholars' work, because obviously that advice isn't just inactionable, it's ridiculous. And so that means that using those metrics to evaluate scholars also ends up looking ridiculous. And so just to kind of drive home this point, I'd like to share this next abstract from Merritt. So I'll give you just a chance to read the abstract. And so the point here is the last sentence in the abstract. White men average significantly more citations than did minorities. And so what was interesting to me wasn't just this first part of the abstract, but actually the second half of the abstract after that sentence. So I'm going to go to that in the next slide, and I'll give you a minute to read that. And so here, basically what Merritt is arguing is, well, if we take into account all of those systemic differences in society that lead to disparities in opportunity, well, then we can actually eliminate the citation gap for scholars. But the kind of the irony or the problem with that is the larger disparities in society are what are causing those gaps. And so trying to evaluate scholars based on their number of times they've been cited or the number of times they've been published is actually perpetuating those differences in the larger society. So you're taking people who have had less opportunity in society generally, and you're punishing them even more for having had less opportunity. And then I think that last sentence is particularly salient to the argument we've been making. As these differences diminish, already modest gaps in citation counts should decline as well. Well, this is research that was published in 2000, and we've already summarized research for you that was published in 2023 that also noted the gap in these citation counts between minority and non-minority scholars. And so that shows you that this gap hasn't declined, but is instead persisting, and so is a particularly problematic feature of using citations to evaluate scholarship. And I think as scholars, it's also our responsibility to suggest possible alternatives. So what we've done so far is problematize the current paradigm in the field, but without suggesting alternatives, we're kind of leaving an incomplete picture. And so what we wanted to do was turn to some possible alternatives next. John?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's look just at a few of those alternative conceptions of what we could say is knowledge production, so publishing our work. Gopalakrishna et al. Wrote an interesting article about this, and they said that, well, we need to encourage the curbing of this culture of publish or perish. And why do we need to encourage this curbing trend away from publish or perish? Is because we need to maintain research integrity. So they use the expression research integrity. So instead of pursuing just citation with impact factor and scopus, they say it's not integrity in itself. Salaga Meyer has written quite extensively about some alternatives, and she's kind of skeptical about the ethics of some of the large publishing house journals because they charge very high author publication charges, APCs, to publish if you want it to be open access. Or those journals also, charge very high subscription rates to libraries. Now, the effect of these high APCs and high subscription rates to libraries is that developing countries, universities, scholars can't afford it. They can't afford to pay APCs. Their libraries can't afford the high subscription rates. So they simply can't have access to the journals or publish in those large publishing house journals. The alternative then, as suggested by Salaga Meyer, is to move back to giving more credit to publishing in local or regional journals, not just in English. And those local and regional journals could be open access, or charge very, very low APC to authors, which are reasonable so that you don't just empty their research budget just for one publication. And these local and regional journals, either in English or the local language, need to be accredited by the Ministry of Education in their country and their university review board. So there needs to be a move away from the indexing organizations and the large publishing house journals. Now, finally, then, quantitative metrification is, as Ala and Theron explained to you, it's sometimes flawed, but it needs to be seen through other lenses. And I'll pass you back to Ala and Theron to expand upon that.
All right. Thank you very much, John. So next, for most of the rest of the presentation, we wanted to turn to some of the ongoing research we've been doing using document analysis of publication records. So this is looking at one university in Japan, one of their faculties, where they produce a library book, basically, that lists all of the publications that faculty had in the previous year. And so this is just to give you a bit of perspective on the kind of data that we've been looking at. And so just to orient you here, the yellow line is it's the medical faculty of the university. And so the yellow line is that medical faculty's English publication totals over time using our document analysis data. And then the red line is the Japanese publications over time using that document analysis data. And finally, that blue line is the sum of both the English and the Japanese over time. And the green line is the Web of Science index for the whole university. So unfortunately, the Web of Science wouldn't let me just pull out the data for one faculty. So what you're seeing there is the whole university, all 9 of its faculties, representation in the Web of Science. So it just kind of coincidentally looks like it mirrors the English publications of one faculty. But keep in mind that yellow line is for 1 out of the 9 faculties, whereas that green line is for all 9 out of the 9 faculties. So just to show you how important those numbers are for the faculty, now we're turning to the Scopus index, which is Elsevier Pure, so Scopus, the journal index, was bought by Elsevier relatively recently. And so the university has this website where they basically advertise the number of manuscripts they have listed in Elsevier and the number of citations that they've accumulated in Elsevier. So this is to kind of show you how important these metrics are to the faculty or to the university. And then we also wanted to show you the numbers for the specific faculty. We're looking at the Faculty of Medicine, so you can see those here. And then we wanted to give you an idea of just how unrepresentative this is of the faculty's larger output. And so that's what this next slide is. So you can see there's journal articles, conference papers, reviews, book chapters, and then on the far left column with the numbers is the Elsevier Scopus count. And then next to that is the document analysis total. And then we've got the Japanese article total and the English article total, and then the other language total. And so basically the argument we wanted to make is for every manuscript category, the Elsevier Scopus count is considerably lower than the total number of publications that we could document using the document analysis. And then when you go to the bottom there, you can see the Elsevier total is about 13,000 and the document analysis total is just under 100,000. And so Elsevier is only capturing about 13% of that faculty's overall output when we look at the journal publication report records. And so next, we wanted to give a brief overview of some of the methods of the data analysis we've been doing. And for that, I'll turn you over to Ala.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Theron. So as Professor Theron mentioned that our study uses document analysis as the main research methods, and we have used the definition by Althide as it of the document analysis, as it is a systematic process of locating, identifying, and analyzing documents to understand their significance and meaning. So this approach is particularly useful for our historical document research because it allows us to track patterns and trends over time. So in our investigation, we accessed the University of Toyama repository, which offers publications data spanning for over 47 years. And this rich data source enabled a historical document analysis. So it allowed us to examine changes in language medium, publication frequency, and also the trends over nearly 5 decades. So the faculty unit reports are organized by yearly publication data for all the medical faculty members, and they cover all publication types. They were categorized by English language, Japanese language, or some other languages. And by analyzing these reports, we were able to identify different analyses and correlations. So I will give you just an example, such as that Japanese faculty members correlate positively with English publications and correlate negatively with Japanese language publications, meaning that as the number of Japanese faculty members increase, the frequency of Japanese language article decreases. And that gives us like a picture or a prediction for the upcoming years also. Also, you will notice in the next slides that we have mentioned the impact of foreign faculty members on research production over time. So we could say that this method provided insights that would be very difficult to capture using other qualitative approaches. And also our analysis provided us with new insights that databases like Web of Science or Elsevier couldn't capture. So I will leave Professor Thern to explain the graphs in the next slides.
All right. Thank you very much, Ala.
Thank
So
you.
this is the overall, this is the total data for the medical faculty. So at the bottom, we're tracking by year, and then you can see the number on the y-axis is the number of publications per faculty member. So we've tried to normalize this a little bit by looking at publications per faculty rather than total publications. And so I just wanted to walk you through some of what we can see based on this data. So first of all, if we look at the next slide here, you can see this big dip that was caused by the COVID pandemic. Then on the next slide, you can see another dip that looks like it was perhaps caused by the 2011 earthquake in Japan. And then here we have potentially the Lehman shock that happened around 2007, 2008. And then next we have the privatization of national universities in Japan, which happened around 2004. And then here we may have the results of the September 11 attacks in New York impacting on travel and therefore reductions in conference papers. And then here we may have the Asian financial crisis, the effects of that. And then finally, we may have the bursting of the Japanese economic bubble in the early 90s. And so basically, those are all the arrows that I showed to you in the previous slides. And so kind of based on these insights, if you're using publication output to evaluate faculty, the kind of advice you might be able to give is do not be a faculty member during global pandemics. Do not be a faculty member when terrorist attacks happen. Do not be a faculty member during financial crises. And so hopefully what that shows you is how ridiculous it is to use these metrics to evaluate faculty output, because faculty output appears to be a reflection of larger things going on in society rather than dependent on individual effort within a given faculty. Just to look at some additional trends These are looking at journal papers. And so you can see these are looking at journal papers in English. And so you can see that red bar over on the left is quite small, which means that there were a small number of English journal articles published per person in the late 70s. And then you can see it ends on the right quite wide. And so the number of English journal articles being published increased considerably over time in the data that we have. And then the opposite trend was reflected for Japanese. So you can see it starts quite wide in the late 70s on the left, and then it ends up quite narrow on the right in 2023. And so that means that Japanese journal publication decreased over that time period. And because most indexes are English-centric, Anglo-centric, those kinds of trends you wouldn't be able to find in those indexes because they wouldn't necessarily track Japanese publication very accurately. And so we also wanted to ask the question, what other insights does document analysis of publication records facilitate? And these insights are thanks to Allah. She ended up looking at whether foreign faculty in a given faculty unit had some kind of an influence on the publication trends within that unit. And so basically we didn't just get the numbers for the whole faculty, but we got the numbers for each individual unit within the faculty. And so it was possible to separate out faculty units that had foreign faculty and faculty units that didn't have foreign faculty. And so here on the left, you can see that if there's foreign faculty in the unit within the faculty, the number of journal papers in English increases and the number of conference papers in English increases relative to units that only have Japanese faculty. And then on the right, we're looking at Japanese publication, and perhaps surprisingly, while journal publication decreases a bit, you can see that the Japanese conference papers and the other Japanese papers increase considerably relative to when foreign faculty are there, relative to when there are only Japanese faculty. And then this next slide is basically putting all those together, looking at the total numbers rather than separating them out by English and Japanese. And so you can see when there are foreign faculty present, journal articles are slightly higher, and also the conference papers and the others are slightly higher. And with that, these are our references. And then once again, here's a QR code to our slides. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.